Have you ever held a Bible in your hand? I mean, like really held it and thought about the journey it took to get here?
It's wild, right?
Totally. It's this ancient text, a collection of writings from over centuries.
It's amazing to think about all those different authors, all those different voices coming together.
And to think it's considered a unified whole, it makes you wonder, how was the Bible actually written?
That's exactly what we're diving into today.
And we're doing it with a little help from Texto Colado and their episode, How is the Bible Written? From divine inspiration to profound poetry.
They really get into the heart of it, the interplay of divine inspiration and human creativity.
Yeah, that whole divine inspiration thing, that's always tripped me up a bit. Like, how much influence did God actually have on those writers?
Well, it's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Rightfully so.
Instead of picturing God dictating every single word, try thinking about it like this. Remember 2 Timothy 3.16.
Vaguely. Help me out.
It talks about all scripture being God-breathed.
Okay, yeah.
That breath. Think of it as the animating force, the spark that brings something to life.
So it's more about guiding the overall message, those core truths, rather than controlling every comma and semicolon.
You got it. It's like a symphony,
I
right?
like where you're going with this.
God is the composer, the one with the grand vision. But each author is like a musician, bringing their own unique style, their own instrument to the orchestra.
Now, that's an analogy I can get behind. It explains how we can have this timeless message resonating throughout, but still acknowledge the very human fingerprints on each page.
Those fingerprints are essential because it means the Bible isn't this distant, untouchable document.
You're saying it's more relatable.
Exactly. It was written by real people, living, breathing individuals who were products of their own time and culture. That's what makes it both profoundly divine and undeniably human.
Okay, so let's talk about the human side of things.
Let's.
Texto Colado pointed out that there were over 40 authors, kings, shepherds, fishermen. Talk about a diverse writing staff.
And get this, they were spread out over a span of almost 1,500 years.
1,500 years. To put that into perspective, that's like comparing something written when the Roman Empire was at its peak to something written, say, right after Shakespeare died.
It's a mind-boggling span of time.
No wonder it feels so layered and complex sometimes. It makes you appreciate how challenging it must have been to maintain a unified message across such a vast expanse of time and culture.
You're telling me. It's truly remarkable. And to understand how they managed to do it, it's essential to understand the individual authors and the unique things each one brought to the table.
Like Moses, for example. Traditionally, he's considered the author of the first 5 books of the Bible.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5. He was writing from this incredible position of leadership, but also as a prophet, believed to have spoken with God directly.
Wow, it's like getting a first-hand account.
You could say that, yes.
Thinking about how these stories originated, it's hard not to imagine them being passed down orally, at least at first, before ever being written down.
Absolutely. Long before widespread literacy, oral tradition was how knowledge and beliefs were preserved, how history was kept alive. Imagine a time when these stories were entrusted to memory, passed down through generations.
Amazing. Especially in a culture like ancient Israel where storytelling was so central. But how did they eventually make that leap from whispered stories to the written word?
It was a gradual process, but the episode points to, you guessed it, Moses.
Moses again.
He's believed to have been one of the first to start writing those oral traditions down. The stories of creation, the flood, the patriarchs, they all started as spoken word, passed down through generations.
And he took on the massive task of turning them into written text.
It must have been an incredible undertaking, almost like translating a whole world of spoken tradition into a new language, the language of writing.
And once those early writings existed, how did they eventually become what we know as the Bible? Someone didn't just gather a bunch of scrolls and decide to make a book, right?
Not quite. Think of it more like a library that took centuries to build. As new prophets came onto the scene, as kings decided to record their reigns, as those early Christians documented their lives and their beliefs, the body of Scripture just grew organically. But it wasn't just about the writing itself, it was about survival.
That makes me think about those ancient scrolls you see in museums, super fragile, carefully preserved.
Exactly. And we have countless scribes to thank for that, people who dedicated their lives to meticulously copying those texts by hand.
Wow, talk about a labor of love.
Seriously. And those scribes, they weren't just copying words. They saw themselves as guardians of something sacred.
They must have felt an incredible sense of responsibility.
Absolutely. They knew that if they weren't incredibly careful, Those stories, those teachings, they could be lost forever.
It makes you wonder what they would thought if they knew that we'd be sharing those same stories today on our phones, on podcasts.
Right. It really highlights how these stories, they've transcended time and technology. But you know what else is amazing to me? Is not just the stories themselves, but the sheer diversity of the literature you find in the Bible.
It's true. We often talk about the Bible as if it's one book with one voice.
When in reality, it's like a whole library of genres.
You're right. There's history, poetry, law. What else am I missing?
Prophecy, philosophical reflections, even personal letters.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. So where do we even start with a literary mixtape like that?
Well, let's start with the foundation narratives. These are the stories that grab your attention, pull you in, and transport you through time.
The epics.
Exactly. Genesis, Exodus.
David and Goliath. Those classic stories.
They've captivated people for centuries, and they still resonate with us today. And for good reason. They explore those timeless themes of good versus evil, temptation, betrayal.
Those universal truths we can all relate to.
Absolutely. And don't let those dramatic plot lines fool you. They're full of symbolism and deeper meanings, too.
There's something in there for everyone, no matter what walk of life you come from.
Precisely. And we can't forget about the poetry.
Yeah.
The Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs. Such raw emotion in those books.
So much wisdom, too. They really tap into those deep human experiences we all share.
They do. You know, Texo Collado actually shared a line from Psalm 23 that always stuck with me. It said, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me."
That's beautiful. It really captures the essence of faith and resilience. And that's what I love about digging deeper into the Bible. When you take the time to appreciate the different genres, the nuances of each book, it just comes alive in a whole new way.
Absolutely. And speaking of powerful voices, we can't forget the prophets.
Oh, they definitely weren't afraid to speak their mind.
They were like the conscience of their time, calling out injustice and reminding people about their covenant with God.
They didn't sugarcoat anything, that's for sure. I've always been struck by their language. So vivid, so powerful.
That's the beauty of your poetry, right? It wasn't just about delivering a message. It was about making you feel it in your soul.
And some of those messages, even though they were written thousands of years ago, they still feel incredibly relevant today.
They do. It really makes you wonder what those prophets would say about the world we're living in right now.
I'd love to hear their take on things, that's for sure. But beyond the narratives and the poetry, there are those parts of the Bible that don't always get a lot of attention.
Like the legal texts.
Yeah. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all those rules and regulations, they always seemed kind of dense and, well, a little boring.
I get it, but they're more interesting than you might think.
Yeah.
Those texts, they weren't just about religious rituals.
They weren't.
Nope. They delved into things like property rights, how to treat the poor, even basic hygiene.
Wow, it's like a window into what daily life was like back then.
Exactly. It shows us that their faith wasn't confined to temples and sacrifices. It was interwoven into every aspect of their lives.
It makes you realize how much we have in common with those who came before us, even if they lived in a very different time.
We do.
Oh.
And speaking of connections across time, we have to talk about those early Christian writings too. I'm talking about the epistles.
Those letters.
Yes,
Yeah.
they always feel so immediate, so personal.
It's like we're eavesdropping on the earliest days of Christianity.
Exactly, and that's because they were never meant to be some grand theological statement. These were letters of guidance and encouragement written to real people who were wrestling with this new faith.
It's kind of reassuring in a way, isn't it? To know that even back then, people were struggling with similar doubts and questions.
Totally. But we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about one last genre one that's always captured people's imaginations.
Which is?
Apocalyptic literature. And the book of Revelation, well, it's the ultimate example.
Oh, Revelation. Now that's a wild ride. I've always found it both fascinating and a little bit terrifying.
It's definitely not your typical bedtime story.
Hmm.
But that's part of what makes it so compelling. The symbolism, the imagery of heaven and hell, the message of hope amidst chaos. It's really unlike anything else in the Bible.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure. And, with so many different authors, so many unique voices from across the centuries, it really makes you wonder, how can we be sure that what we're reading today is even close to what those original writers intended? How did they make sure these texts were accurately preserved?
That's where the meticulous work of those scribes we talked about earlier comes in. The episode highlighted the Masoretes, those ancient Hebrew scholars, remember?
Vaguely.
They were absolutely dedicated to making sure every single letter of those Hebrew scriptures was perfectly preserved. Can you imagine the kind of focus it took to hand copy those scrolls word for word without making a single mistake?
I can barely get through a text message without a typo.
Right. These guys were next level. It just goes to show how seriously they took their responsibility.
We were like guardians of these sacred texts, entrusted with a mission much bigger than themselves.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the Masoretes either.
Who else?
Think about those early Christians, right? The ones risking their lives to copy and share those first letters from Paul. The ones who carefully wrote down everything they remembered about Jesus. Their dedication was essential.
It was their way of making sure the message spread and survived.
Exactly. It was like this incredible relay race across centuries. Each generation passing on those stories, those teachings to the next.
Making sure nothing got lost along the way. But even with all that care, they still had another hurdle.
Right.
Language. How do you make sure those ancient texts could be understood by people who didn't speak ancient Hebrew or Aramaic?
That's where translation comes in.
And that's no easy task. How do you even begin to capture all those layers of meaning, all that cultural and historical context in another language?
It's incredibly challenging. And Texto Collado brought up a great example, the Septuagint.
The Septuagint.
The first known translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek.
Okay.
And get this, it happened centuries before Jesus lived.
Wow, that long ago.
That's right. And it was huge because it bridged in that linguistic and cultural gap, made those scriptures accessible to a much wider audience.
It's amazing to think about how early that translation work began. It really paved the way for the Bible to become what it is today, the most translated book in history.
Absolutely. And that process, it's still ongoing. Scholars and translators, they're always striving to make those ancient texts relevant and accessible to new generations.
It's like we're all part of this ongoing conversation that started thousands of years ago. It's pretty mind-blowing. But those early translations, they must run into some serious challenges. Like, how do you accurately translate a concept or a word that doesn't even exist in another language?
It happened all the time. There are words in Hebrew that have so many layers of meaning, making them incredibly difficult to translate with precision.
Give me an example.
Sure. One that comes up often is the word often translated as righteousness. In Hebrew, it goes way beyond just being morally good. It's also about living in right relationship with God and with other people. It even has social justice implications.
Wow. So much packed into a single word.
Exactly. And that's just one example. You can see how translation becomes about so much more than just substituting words. It's about bridging entire worlds of meaning.
It's an art form in itself, really.
You could say that?
It's awe-inspiring, isn't it? To go from those whispered stories around campfires all those years ago to these carefully copied scrolls to, well, us having these amazing texts right at our fingertips.
It's quite a legacy, isn't it?
It really is. And it's all thanks to the dedication of countless people across time who recognized just how important these stories were and how crucial it was to keep them alive.
And knowing that backstory, doesn't it add a whole other dimension to reading the Bible? These aren't just words on a page. They're the echoes of voices from across millennia.
It reminds us that the Bible isn't meant to be some untouchable, static thing, but a living tapestry, woven from the threads of countless lives, beliefs, and experiences. A combination of, as many believe, divine inspiration and those very human hands that put pen to paper or, stylus to clay tablet.
Exactly. And just like with any work of art, the more you understand its creation, the deeper your appreciation becomes.
You start to notice details you might have missed before.
You see its complexities, its beauty, even its imperfections in a whole new light.
And maybe, just maybe, it changes how we approach reading it. Instead of passively accepting every word, we're inspired to engage with the text, to ask questions, to wrestle with it a bit.
To make it our own.
Exactly, because ultimately the Bible isn't some ancient relic. It's a living, breathing text that continues to speak to us today. It's a story that we're all a part of, a conversation that's been going on for centuries. And now that we spent some time unpacking its origins, its journey to us, well, I'm curious,
I bet.
how will you approach it differently? What will you listen for now that you know the human stories, the dedication, the painstaking work that went into crafting this book?